Bom, boa noite a todas e todos. Hoje é segunda-feira, 15 de junho. Vamos a mais uma entrevista da série de entrevistas do nosso segundo Simpósio Direitas Brasileiras, Bolsonaro no Poder. Meu nome é André Kaysel, sou professor da Universidade Estadual de Campinas e estarei acompanhado hoje pelo meu colega Jorge Chaloub, da Universidade de Juiz de Fora, da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora, e também com apoio dos trabalhos técnicos do José Maria Otávio, da Secretaria de Eventos do IFISH Unicamp. E hoje temos o grande prazer e a grande honra de ter aqui um convidado internacional, o professor Benjamin Teitelbaum, que é professor do Departamento de Musicologia da Universidade de Colorado, Boulder. O professor Teitelbaum lançou recentemente o livro War for Eternity, sobre o tradicionalismo, em particular, o papel de atores políticos como Steve Bannon, Olavo de Carvalho e Alexander Dugin, mostrando como uma corrente intelectual ideológica marginal da extrema-direita conseguiu atingir posições-chave de poder no mundo. Uma leitura fascinante, infelizmente ainda não traduzida para o português. Então, sem mais delongas, vamos começar a nossa entrevista. Benjamin, thank you for being with us today. As I said earlier, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here with us discussing this interesting and I would even say fascinating book.
It is a pleasure to be with you, Andre. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And so I will pass to George to make the first questions.
I also thank you, Benjamin, and let's start. Your first studies were in ethnomusicology. How did you start to study traditionalism and right-wing discourses?
So, ethnomusicology, just to catch up any viewers for whom that might be an unfamiliar field, it really is about studying music through ethnography. Arguably, that ethnomusicology belongs more to anthropology than musicology, actually. And so when in 2010 I set out to do my doctoral dissertation, I chose to study the relationship between music and right-wing extremism in Scandinavia in general, and Sweden in particular. And when I was there, I spent most of my time, listening to music, studying the history of music and its role in politics there, but also getting to know all of the people who are making and consuming this music. And it was in that time when you get really close, when you get face to face with people, you really understand how wide the ideological spectrum and how varied the ideological spectrum can be, even within the extreme right. And I encountered people who identified as neo-Nazis, as National Socialists, people who said they were cultural nationalists. But within that spread, there was a small group. It would get bigger after I left the field in my research. Small group called identitarians or identitarianism. And within that small group, there was an even smaller faction of individuals who called themselves radical traditionalists. Traditionalister. And they were so few in number that I almost don't want to call them a group or a faction. And they certainly didn't organize with each other. They were just people who were interested in a set of books and sometimes who had some religious practices that took them, for the most part, outside of right-wing extremism, you could say, or even just right-wing populism. But they were interesting. They weren't thugs. They were well-read. They were curious people. They lived curious lives. And so I kept in touch with them. But, I never thought, George, that they would ever be represented in any political party, let alone a successful political party. I mean, these are people so far on the margins that the word margin is not a strong enough word. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and talking about this concept of traditionalism, You make a distinction in your book between we can say traditionalism with a capital T and like a common sense traditionalism. What can you say about that?
Yeah, it's very hard. I think a lot of people, when they encounter this topic and what I wrote about, it's very hard for them to realize just how strange it is. Because if you hear the word traditionalism, it sounds like something we all know, instead of what it really is, which is something that virtually nobody knows. So the lowercase traditionalism, if I'm just thinking in English, as an American, I could call someone a traditionalist who doesn't like an automatic transmission in their car, who likes to shift themselves between gears. Someone who uses gut strings on their violin as opposed to steel strings. Someone who does things the old-fashioned way. The word traditionalist can mean a lot, and it tends to also mean, if we're speaking casually, if I call my grandpa a traditionalist, I mean that in that case, my grandpa doesn't think that things are always getting better. Let's say. Things used to be better when he was young. Now, the traditionalism that I study in this book, it happens to encompass that, kind of. But it's so much more elaborate. And then it also contains, and this is the key, one of the key differences, it also contains a sort of apocalyptic vision that, someone who likes to fish with an old-fashioned fish fly does not have, let's say. So, to kind of pick that out a little bit more, the traditionalists who I've studied, they also think that things used to be better, but they believe in cyclic time. They do not believe typically that time proceeds linearly. And a consequence of that is that they believe that what was great in the past isn't necessarily past, that it's not inextricably lost to us, but that it actually is our future. It's a stage of a time cycle that's going to come back to us. And that might sound just kind of strange and benign if we don't go a little bit deeper and see that these traditionalists, the figures I've talked about, they have built an understanding of history and of humanity based on study of world religions, a select number of world religions, and they believe that we advance through our time cycle through decline, in some cases through destruction. And thus that those good old days, that golden age, that time when things were better, they're going to be coming back to us via decline and destruction. And that means, if we can continue this thought and bear with me here, that means also that when things are bad today, and if things are falling apart, or if they see social decay, you might like that, right? Because it might be the signal that things are pushing you forward into this rebound around a time cycle until you're reborn into a golden age. So if I'm to speak briefly and not go off on too much of a tangent with your question, George, that to me is the key difference. Everyone who calls themselves a traditionalist might think things were better. But the traditionalists I study in this book, the radical traditionalists, those who followed the traditionalist school, reading René Bannon and Julius Evola, they might kind of like that things are bad right now. And understanding that is the difference. Yes?
No, you can finish if you wish.
No.
Okay, so taking on your last remarks, could we say that Steve Bannon and Olavo de Carvalho, they innovate in traditionalism, comparing with the original works of René Guénon and Julius Evola? I mean, you have some remarks in the book that suggest that, especially about Steve Bannon's activism and some reserves on Olavo de Carvalho's part to be called or branded a traditionalist. So do you think they innovate inside this lineage?
Absolutely. I mean, and there are two key ways that they do this. So let me start with what I was just talking to you about, the time cycle concept. If traditionalists typically believe that we are cycling through eras, and that we might find ourselves living in a dark age today, but we are going to return to our society's or humanity's golden age. It's just a matter of time. It's almost a schedule, a set schedule, just like the turning of the seasons, just knowing that summer is going to return. Just like that. If you view things in those terms, doctrinarily, as some of the early traditionalists did, following very much in line with Hinduism, there's not a lot of room for activism. And there's not a role for politics necessarily. Some of the figures that I met early in my exposure to traditionalism embodied this, and that they would never join a political party because they don't believe there's anything to be done. The weapon that a traditionalist has is time. It's about preserving yourself and hoping that you live through the predestined schedule for a rebirth into a more glorious era. And Julius Evola spoke about this. He used a metaphor to refer to someone riding the tiger. Quite specifically, the belief that liberalism, or the age that we live in, could be thought of like a living animal that has a life, it grows, it thrives, and then it declines and it dies, and you could live on past it, so long as you don't make the mistake of trying to fight, trying to be an activist, trying to be political. So right off the bat, if you look at someone, especially like Steve Bannon, I think, who has spent so much time putting his name down, trying to change things. Olavo is a much more complicated case, of course, because he weaves in and out of activism and occasionally attaches himself to a cause, occasionally pulls himself back from it, but and is somewhat fatalistic and pessimistic about the future of Brazil. But for Steve Bannon or Alexander Dugin, they see themselves as agents of history. They think that they are perhaps in a position to push and accelerate this time cycle moving forward. And in their cases, that can actually mean some form of destruction or disassembly of the world. So that's one big way that they innovate, is that they see themselves as being activists and having a role that they can play and change the future. The other way, I'll try to be brief, but the early traditionalists viewed society in the ways that a lot of doctrinaire Hindus would, and that a virtuous society is hierarchical, and that you have a sort of pyramid, I'm going to make sure I'm straight here, sort of pyramid hierarchy where you have priests on top, followed by a warrior class, followed by merchants, and finally to slaves. And that hierarchy opposed people valuing spiritual virtues, priests opposite slaves and merchants who valued material pursuits. And so there's something about that right off the bat that's elitist. Typically the priests in classic Hindu conceptions are going to be fewer in number than a mass of slaves, right? And one of the hallmarks of the turning of the ages, the time cycle, is that pyramid gradually breaks down. And we find ourselves where we're all just simply slaves and we're all just chasing bodily gratification or money or something like that. And thus being part of the mass is bad, right? To speak plainly. I suspect that following Olavo de Carvalho, Steve Bannon also views this in reverse fashion almost. He adopts the notion that spiritual values ought to be the values of society, and that they are the reigning values in a past epoch. Opposite materialist values that dominate the world we live in now. But he thinks that the actors embodying those values are different than what the original traditionalists do. He thinks that the masses of society, the very people who early traditionalists thought were just kind of raw material to be shaped by the priestly elites, he thinks that they're the ones today who actually have a claim to spirituality. So Olavo de Carvalho spoke to me about this, and he talked about rural Brazilians who were poor, perhaps brought into a more concrete reality because of that, but also highly spiritual, more devoted to Catholicism and Christianity than other sectors of society, than, let's say, an urban elite. So that anti-elitism, the belief that the rural people and the masses of them might actually be the priests of our day hidden, that's something that both Bannon and Olavo break from. As I mentioned, and I could go into details, but I think that Steve Bannon really picked that idea up from reading Olavo de Carvalho's debate with Alexander Dugin. But it happens to fit very nicely with populism, of course, because this is a way to say that the people, understood as the rural majority people in most cases, have some special gift and are the actual defining element of a national community.
That's quite interesting. This leads me to the third question. That would be how does traditionalism relate to other ideologies in the landscape of the American right, such as paleo or neoconservatism, populism that you mentioned, economic libertarianism or neoliberalism? I mean, how does traditionalism fit and relates in this broader ideological scenario?
It's hard to say, but it has flavors of a number of those ideologies you just mentioned. I'm not sure how familiar people in Brazil are with paleoconservatism. I've always understood that as being a primarily American phenomenon, at least as a named phenomenon. But paleoconservatives also are skeptical of progress.
Yes.
Believe that we could meaningfully get better. Right, and that tends to become most politically fierce and revealed when we see in America, for example, politicians rejecting Enlightenment values. Not treating the American Constitution, which is a product of Enlightenment European thought, not treating that as holy and kind of the ultimate definition of what it means to be American. That's pretty basic for everybody. Paleoconservatives come out and say, no, what it means to be American is something even older than that. It's deeper than the American Constitution, deeper than the Enlightenment, and we're getting away from it, right? Where traditionalists diverge from that is again, especially when we get to the cyclical nature aspect of it. There are a couple other ways, but the biggest one that I see is that whereas a paleoconservative might say, we need to get back to where we were. It was a mistake when we changed this. Traditionalists might much more fatalistically believe that no, the decline, the move away from our past is predestined, but don't worry, we're going to come back around to it as destruction sets in. Populism is a very, very tricky subject because there's enough overlap, and populism in this current form is new enough that we haven't really gotten to see the places where traditionalism and populism don't overlap. We haven't really gotten to see them magnified yet, but there are some differences. I'll start with the similarities though. Traditionalism, by virtue of claiming that we live in a dark age, by virtue of claiming that things used to be better and we've decayed to a critical point, it tends to look at all of the establishments, media, university. I'm afraid for the three of us. It looks at all of them. Government, any establishment, and says, you must necessarily be wrong. You must be flawed. You probably, in fact, if we really are living in the dark age, you probably perpetuate the opposite of what you're supposed to. So if we're university professors, we probably don't teach, we probably confuse and misinform, right? If we were journalists, we would probably spread lies as opposed to truth, right? Medical doctors harm people's bodies. Governments represent the opposite of the people's interest. Those are all traditionalist ideas. And you probably don't need me to say how that fits with populism, right? I mean, that's fairly obvious. The anti-establishment edge of populism, the establishment versus the people opposition, That's like the basic building blocks of populisms. So it works there. Where things, could potentially get rough, of course, is if you have traditionalists in power, and that's also like having populists in power. What do you make of the establishment when you are the establishment all of a sudden? Are we have to start saying that we live in the golden age all of a sudden? Some sort of mental gymnastics is going to be needed to make that work. But another particular problem is that for a lot of traditionalists, also nation states are modernist, and they are products of the Dark Age. They are products of this. I talked about the hierarchy before. They're products of this leveling out, where you used to have a stratified society. Now everybody is all part of the nation. We're all nationals. Some early traditionalists saw that as being nothing but a stepping stone to a global society. Nation states were one step away from global capitalism or communism or whatever. So, these national populists that are going around, there's an embedded critique that's waiting to kind of work itself out there. We would see that. The opposition to, let's say, libertarianism or neoliberalism is slightly more plain. I mean, traditionalists do not like individualism generally. There are ways that some of them work that out, but they typically advocate and believe that what was great about the past was the fact that people lived in communities and had a place in the world and were embedded in something. So both the individualism of global capitalism or libertarianism, and also the progressive nature of it, the notion that we need to constantly be building capital, and that's how one plays the game, and that if we do that, if you build up enough wealth, things are going to be better for you in the future than they've ever been before. That does not work here. So there's a pretty sharp divide there.
And speaking about that, how do you see the role of economy in Steve Bannon and Olavo de Carvalho? And how do they see capitalism?
Yeah, this is interesting because it's a distinction between them. I studied three main figures in my book, and they all look at capitalism a little differently. Steve Bannon, if you asked him on live national TV in the United States if he likes capitalism, he would tell you yes, right? He'd say, yes, capitalism's great. But if you got a few steps down with him, if you had a longer conversation, you would actually hear that he speaks about capitalism in ways that are very different from most American Republicans. He wants to see capitalism subordinated to nationalism. He does not want to see individual actors, let's say in the United States or Brazil, going out on the world stage and doing whatever they want for the accumulation of wealth. He believes that capitalism emerged from a cultural context in the Judeo-Christian West, and that the only way that it can really work and not be a force for bad is if it is contained in that cultural milieu, and again, subordinated to it. For Olavo de Carvalho, I think it's, my read is that capitalism is for him part of a rejection of communism. That it's very much a banner to push back against the political interests domestically that he does not like, these socialist-leaning politicians and regimes that have dominated throughout much of his political life. But also in case of China, to rally behind capitalism is to push back against that global anti-capitalist force as he sees it, communism. But the interesting thing with Olavo, and you see this reflected with Ernesto Araujo also, that capitalism might be a way to attack communism, but the opposite of communism is actually not capitalism in his mind. The enemy of communism is not capitalism. The enemy of communism, as they define it, is spirituality. So I've had some discussions with colleagues, and it's come up in a few book reviews as well. To say that somebody is an anti-communist doesn't say much about them. There's so many different variations of anti-communism, and it's quite telling that for these actors, their anti-communism is not fanatical capitalism. I'm not talking about Bolsonaro, that's another story, but for Olavo, for Ernesto, and these others, rally behind capitalism because it fights against communism, but the goal is actually to support spirituality against what they deem as its primary global foe.
Yeah, and speak about precisely about Olavo de Carvalho, and about his belonging to traditionalism. What about his declared universalism? Because I always, when I read Olavo, I always think, oh, okay, if you think about him as a traditionalist, his universalism is kind of in a different place. I don't know. I want to hear about it.
And it's nothing. My exposure to this concept of his thinking hasn't led me to any simple explanation, because I see two things going on with the universalism. One is it speaks slightly to the branch of traditionalism that he engaged with most closely, which is to say the Fritjof Schoen branch of it, which while observing this idea that that each society might have its own pathway toward something greater, was very, very interested in speaking about that whole. I don't want to get your listeners lost in the weeds here, as we say in the U.S., but there were certain traditionalists who decided, okay, I'm going to convert to Sufism. I'm going to become a Hindu, and I'm going to devote my entire life to that, knowing that this is one of multiple paths, but you're not going to get far on a path if you don't really devote yourself to it. A lot of traditionalists worked that way. The branch that Olavo connected with, Fritjof Schoen, he tried to encompass a bunch of them at once. He was a Sufi master who had, claimed to have been initiated into certain Sioux, Native American Indian spiritual, groupings, was very interested in Christianity, was trying to encompass all of this in one moment. So I see that speaking through with Olavo. Ultimately, one of the reasons that he has celebrated Catholicism, and this comes up in his debate with Alexander Dugin, was precisely because it transcended its roots. Because Catholicism became bigger than Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which had not become a global universal religion. It had become, nothing more than the folk practice of a particular ethnicity, essentially. A very large one, but nonetheless. And so that there's an obvious valuation for that there. The thing that strikes me, where I get confused with Olavo on this point, is that he also can voice some support for particularism. And it's not in connection with traditionalism so much, but I had a conversation with him about Brazil and why does Brazil need to have a national awakening? Why is national pride important for Brazil? And his response to me was, that its expressive culture, its arts, its literature had the right to formulate into its distinct, unique characteristic, so that there could be a Brazilian flavor, in global culture that was in its silo and lived up to its characteristics. It sounds much more like Alexander Dugin and Bannon, who explicitly go against universalism and say that our vision of the world is one where everything is broken down and we live and we exist in our silos. So this is one of those topics that I can't, with Olavo, I don't have a simple pathway through. Yeah.
But speaking about our compatriot, he was a member of, as you recall in your book, of the Brazilian Communist Party before turning towards traditionalism and to the far right. And he's also a reader with some quotes there, because he doesn't really cite him directly, but he attacks him very often, of Antonio Gramsci. Would you see some similarities, and I know you treat this topic in a footnote, between the concept of meta-politics that traditionalists like him use and the work of Antonio Gramsci, or some of his concepts, and what would be the origin of this concept of meta-politics? I mean, sometimes we have the impression that Olavo criticized Gramsci so much, but in the end, he's trying to do what he accuses Gramsci of recommending as a revolutionary politics.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and it is important to recognize, what aspects of Gramsci he criticizes. He doesn't fault him for being ineffective,
Yes.
right? The content of the ideology gets called lots of names, but the actual methodology being brought out here, is not always put at fault. So if we back up for a moment, and think, I mean, I'm sure, I'm speaking to Brazilians here, I'm sure everyone has read their Marxism and things like that. But if Antonio Gramsci makes his mark in Marxism by rejecting the absolute predictability of materialism in this sort of base superstructure relationship, in Marx analysis, saying that actually political change is not the after effect of a change in material relations, but that things can be more complicated, and actually cultural values might exist in some case as their own nucleus, their own instigator to other changes. They might change politics, which might thereafter change material relations, and thus that there's a greater dynamism rather than a simple beginning and an end process to social and political change. By introducing culture as being an instigator of change, he inspires a lot of actors to start, political actors, to not look at, let's just take over governments, but instead let's look at where values and sentiments are formed. And that could be universities, it could be literature, it could be expressive culture like music. That the concept of culture here is quite wide. And Olavo is hardly the first actor on the right to look at that, to see Gramsci's plan and to see it actually in their minds working especially the liberal democratic West, and wanting thereafter to mimic it. So the term that comes out of France primarily, with an ideological school called the Nouvelle Droite, the New Right, around Alain Devenois and Guillaume Faye, some other actors, is metapolitics. That instead of investing yourself in formal politics, if you really want to change society, you need to go up above politics and get to the actual root cause. See if you can reach people in the places where they really are becoming who they are as political thinkers. And for these people, it was intellectualism, it was education, it was to do exactly what they thought the left did. And so, my goodness, this is exactly what Olavo does. I have an awful hard time explaining to people in the United States just what his role is, because he doesn't have an official governmental post, but he does a lot of public commentary. Of course, he does a lot of media, but he does philosophy, he does education. And a lot of the people who have thought about this, who have read their Gramsci, they actually are invested in a scattershot of initiatives. It's not one thing, it's so many different avenues. It can be education, media, it can be expressive culture. In the case of Steve Bannon and Alexander Dugin, they each do this as well. Steve Bannon, notably, I don't know if you saw the news, but he recently had his school approved. He's going to start doing formal education in Italy, it seems, but he has worked in media, he has worked in social media, he's worked in the arts, in Hollywood, producing films. Alexander Dugin has done a lot of theater, believe it or not. Has been a professor, writes books, media. So this this is what they prefer to do rather than being politicians themselves. This is where you change things. So, and that's metapolitics, and yes, it's inspired by Gramsci.
This is really very interesting for us because, well, Gramscian thought had a very important entry in Brazilian left, especially in the redemocratization years in the 70s and 80s. So it's understandable that Carvalho would take Gramsci as his principal foe, but it's interesting that he also, in certain ways, acts accordingly. And Alain Benoit, which is not so known down here, would be the bridge between one and the other. But let me get back to a more theoretical topic. How do traditionalists treat the relationship between individualism and the need for order and hierarchy? That are two topics that you previously treated. Mm-hmm. And how does this manner of treating both individual freedom and the necessity for order and hierarchy fit in a world with such strong movements as feminism, LGBT, and Black movements, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So, at the outset, it's not a very complicated response to your question. Individualism is scorned by the original traditionalists.
Yes.
Individualism in just about any way you might think of it. Julius Evola has some qualifiers to it, of course. But but in general, living up to one's place in the world, being in line to being authentic to one's place in the world is a sort of taken for granted virtue. And that can be resigning yourself to a caste hierarchy. It can also be belonging to kind of a local collective and a whole, as opposed to just being a free-floating agent. Now, for Alexander Dugin, we can see the traces of that relatively clearly. Traditionalists like him, views one of the virtues of Russia and Eurasia to be the absence of individualism. To be the collective nature of it. He thinks that even there's a sort of metaphysics to the geography of Russia, the fact that it is land bound for so much of its space, that it lends itself to stasis, to stability, to bringing people together. Whereas the North Atlantic is a space of movement, where individuals can circulate. And that works fairly well for him. He doesn't break away from that, and he'll speak about collective freedom, right? But being opposed to individualism is relatively unproblematic. When it gets to Olavo and Bannon, that's quite a bit more difficult. In Bannon's case, because he's also trying to fuse traditionalism with American nationalism, an American nationalism in which individuality is paramount, and social mobility, the ability to move yourself around, is paramount. I think that's one of the reasons why when he and I were talking, and in the thinking that he has done about traditionalism, he needed to introduce some sort of individual freedom into the system, and he believed instead, he said, not a caste hierarchy, but let's let individuals climb this spiritual hierarchy in the way that most Americans want to imagine climbing a material hierarchy, climb up through different classes. That's how Bannon reconciled that while still staying in the realm of traditionalism. But it was a problem, because you don't want to say you're opposed to individuality. And my understanding is with Olavo, he, as a teacher, he has described himself as being, intimately invested intensely invested in the individual capacities of his students and being attentive to all of that. What had struck me when I was doing my research was that he did not want to have some totalizing account of all of his students. He wanted to have a sort of particular way of dealing with them that wouldn't work in standard education in a society of massification. So, it was almost as if some competing traditionalist ideas were working themselves out with him. As to how all of this relates to LGBT feminist movements, I've had deeper conversations about this with Dugin. In fact, where he sees us actually, what might at first appear to be some sort of group mobilization, all women coming together, all minority groups coming together, LGBT people uniting as a collective, that the end goal actually of all that activism is isolation. That is ultimate individualism, that one becomes a feminist or a gay rights activist so that eventually all associations that might be given to femininity, to homosexuality, will be pulled away, and in their place we will just have the singular individual about whom we can assume nothing and about whom and for whom there are no given collectivities. There are lots of right-wing critiques of feminism and LGBTQ activism, things like that. But it's notable that for Dugin in particular, from a traditionalist perspective, that his critique of it is that it leads to individualism, that it leads to loneliness and isolation and things like that. That's actually what feminism is all about. So.
Perfect. Talking about the institutional networks of traditionalism and their relations with, big capitalist actors, with big companies, how they finance the institutional networks of the movement.
Mm-hmm. There's not going to be a lot of institutional networks for them. It's very informal, and what the institutions that most of them have been affiliated with have slipped out of their hands almost immediately. I mean, Olavo is an exception to that, in part because he does not affiliate with many institutions. He is his own institution, but for Bannon and for Dugin in particular, they have not stayed consistently with partners that long. And that might actually bode well for their ability to cooperate with each other, because they're single actors. But among the partnerships that have come and gone have been financiers, of course. Both Bannon and Dugin have had major billionaire donors who were interested in politics and who wanted them to do particular things. In Bannon's case, that was the Mercer family, Robert and Rebecca Mercer, who you may be familiar with. They essentially were responsible for bringing him into Donald Trump's presidential campaign. And they were the ones also who killed his communication with Trump later, enormously impactful for his relationship with the president in the United States. In Alexander Dugin's case, you have an ultra-Orthodox, Christian Orthodox financier who's very interested in media, but who is also very interested in Europe. And Dugin was able to exploit that relationship on both fronts, so that he was well funded when he was working in Europe, and his media initiatives had real muscle behind them. Both of those partnerships fell out, like everything else did. And right now, Steve Bannon has a new benefactor. He's being paid quite a bit per year to wage all-out war on China and the Communist Party of China, and that's Miles Gu who is paying him for that, and that relationship has been relatively stable. However, Steve has had a lot of ammunition against China recently. But a big question for Brazilians, of course, and it's one that I don't know. I actually don't know much about the financial backing of Olavo de Carvalho. He leads a pretty humble life in Virginia. Of course, I've been to his place. But he, I would assume, would have some sort of backing. He has a lot of legal troubles, as you all know, at the moment, and I find it, slightly hard to believe that could be borne entirely on the back of just an average person making an unremarkable average salary in the United States.
Yes. Well, I'll take a remark on that, and then I will go to my last question. You know that recently Olavo he issued a audio in social media sharply criticizing Bolsonaro with his usual bad names and this and that, and also the entrepreneurs, capitalists related to Bolsonaro. And immediately afterwards, one of these entrepreneurs asked his colleagues to donate to Olavo. So the main interpretation was he was in search of money. He was blackmailing them for money because he had some important legal issues. Brazilian singer Caetano Veloso recently won a case against him, and Olavo owes him more than 2 million reais. It's a lot of money, so $500,000. So he was just exerting pressure on Bolsonarist entrepreneurs to donate. I think this is quite possible as an explanation. So he has some kind of a donator network, but it's usually discreet because we don't see him associated to anybody usually. But now let me go back to Dugin and Bannon, this fascinating relationship that you reconstitute in your book, especially this meeting, which you didn't have access to, but you probabilistically reconstituted what they were talking about. And the main difference between them was that Bannon was trying to convince Dugin to support an alliance between USA and Russia against China. But this, which you talked about a little bit ago when you said about Bannon's relationship with this Chinese dissident billionaire, Gu. But this goes in the opposite direction of Vladimir Putin's actual policy, that is, towards an alliance with China against the US. So the question is, how does traditionalism collide with the usual ways in which policy makers conceive of geopolitics and the national interests? You talk a lot about geopolitics in your book, and Dugin is a specialist in this field, but how does traditionalism fit or not fit into geopolitics, rationale, realpolitik, etc.?
It was quite striking. If we could kind of speak in favorable terms about Olavo. I thought he was fairly creative when he actually confronted Alexander Dugin, a Russian who had spent, so much of his energy saying that, traditionalism, it hasn't, in fact, if we want to fight on behalf of tradition and against modernity, there's a geopolitical manifestation of this, and we need to fight on behalf of the East against the West. If we do that, we're fighting for tradition against modernity. And Olavo questioned in a famous debate that he had with Alexander Dugin whether or not tradition and modernity could even be conceptualized in geopolitical terms. Whether or not this was wrong, whether or not all of these nation states might have more in common with each other than not. whether or not the rural populations in these countries actually had a one-to-one relationship with their governments, and so on and so forth. And I like the question that you're asking, Andrea, because you're kind of asking me to reason through traditionalism, what the correct response would be to this, what this calls out in terms of geopolitics. I would say that certainly if our geopolitical order today is based upon trade, let's say,
yes.
If geopolitical alliances emerge partly out of economic concerns and to leverage economic aspirations, I think we can safely say traditionalists wouldn't, the early traditionalists would not like that. And that these figures who are acting today who oppose a geopolitics based on economic pursuit are living in alignment with their philosophy. It's also, I think, fair to say that secular political values that are deemed universal, like universal human rights, democracy, that those values would not be given the sacrosanct status that they have in a lot of geopolitical maneuvering, even though there's a lot of hypocrisy around that as well.
Yes.
Talk to an American about Saudi Arabia and see that there are limitations of that. But it's partially how our public discourse works, at least in the United States. And traditionalism, on account of the novelty of those ideas, on account of their secularism, and on account of their universality, might look at them, I think, reasonably with a degree of suspicion. So what ought to replace it? Presumably something more archaic. Presumably states that would prioritize spirituality as a principle would turn toward other states that prioritize spirituality as a principle. A key distinction, a key problem for Alexander Dugin and Steve Bannon was that for Dugin, that meant any spirituality. Look at the theocracies, the theocratic states that exist in the world. They should all be united. Potentially Israel with Iran. That type of alliance might be more called into question. Whereas for Steve Bannon, it meant particular religions. It meant that, okay, Brazil, the United States, Russia, we are all Christian. I don't know if Steve Bannon has seen Candomblé ever before. But we're just to say, because Brazil's a Christian nation, so is Russia, so is the United States. They should all be together, and they should be opposite all of those states that aren't operating in that fashion. And the more Christian the state, the better. And the more untarnished by modernity, that maybe that state should play a bigger role. He once said this to me. I believe that Ernesto Araújo, although I can't say that with certainty, I think that this came from a conversation they had, but that he believed that Brazil has not modernized as much as other Christian nations, and therefore Brazil might have, actually be able to be a source of new Christian vitality for the United States and Europe, and that's why we all have to get together. Those are the two variations, but they're both a way of looking at geopolitics that in some way prioritizes, religion and spirituality over the material.
So in this way, we could say that as Dugin prioritizes China because China is not Western, is not individualistic, is more collectivistic, Bannon would prioritize U.S.-Russia relations because they are both Christian against a non-Christian materialist China. So two opposite ways of reading the same basic logic.
Absolutely, and embedded in that also is an analysis of what the United States is. Dugin views the United States as the ultimate modernism. It was crafted in modernity. It has no tradition of its own, really. It just plowed over Native Americans, and so he wants to see it destroyed. He also believes anybody who's interested in destroying it is a friend of his. Bannon thinks that the United States has a sort of holy, sacred role in world history, and that it's actually beneath its Enlightenment facade actually is containing and incubating spiritual values, and can be a partner of Russia. I mean, so it's important to see there too that that differing ontology of the United States is active here.
It's curious because I think that Olavo de Carvalho's view of the United States is closer than Steve Bannon, than Dugin's view of the United States. I think that Olavo sees a really traditional USA that is really close to Bannon. But one last question besides that, with coronavirus, how the traditionalists see coronavirus and in their cycle view of history?
The two that I have the best insight on, who I've spoken to about it, are Dugin and Bannon, of course, and it's quite striking. I don't want to say that they're happy about it, because that's quite an accusation to make, but both Dugin and Bannon, when I talked to them about it, they saw a lot of benefit to it, and they see this as being, yes, the termination. We're in the terminal stages of the Dark Age. For Dugin, he thinks that the coronavirus is divine punishment for globalism, for globalization. That all of our channels of movement and exchange have now had poison put into them by a divine being. And, so people get to choose, and I remember this quote that he told to me: people can choose between life or liberalism right now. If you're going to move around and break the laws of nature by being a globalist and a cosmopolitan, it seems like deities are going to kill you for it right now. And Bannon also sees this as, one upheaval, which is a major topic of fascination for him, but also, that the way that you get around this is borders and solidarity, group solidarity, not individualism. To go back to what we were talking about earlier, the free-floating individual who does not care about others and also is going to move in any which way he or she wants is vulnerable and is now the prime target of this new logic emerging in the coronavirus. So that's something that they share. They diverge on topics of China. Dugin suggested maybe it was planted in China by U.S. He speculated, didn't confirm that. Bannon has thought that China created this. Olavo, of course, has talked a lot, about China's role in this. Ernesto Araujo has also said that, this is part of a plan. It's no mistake that it's emerging from China, where the prevailing response is not breakdown in borders, but actually global cooperation, global mobilization. The WHO, things like that we're seeing globalism emerging from China again. It was communism and now it's the coronavirus, but it's mass border breaking phenomena coming out of China. So, overarching, we can say, yes, it's bad. They see the cataclysmic nature of it, but a lot of their pre-existing narratives are also being confirmed by it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was an excellent interview. We would like to thank you again, Benjamin, for not only for your time, but for your in-depth views on such an important topic. I mean, when I began reading your book, I comment with George. I said, "Oh, I thought that the most mad people would be, let's say, Joseph de Maistre or Louis Ambroise de Bonald, the so-called ultramontane Catholicism in the far right." But I discovered that there's plenty more of madness in this field, and they really got to very powerful positions. So it was really fascinating to learn more about figures that we all follow in the news, such as Bannon or Olavo, but to know them more closely. And I think that only the insight of someone who works with ethnography, like yourself, could take us closer to them, bypassing obstacles such as prejudices, stereotypes, and the ideological divide. This methodological comment you make in the beginning of the book is very suggestive of that. I mean, ethnography makes you try to see the world through the lenses of others, such as Ruth Benedict suggested in her anthropological work, and I think that you did this quite well in your book, and we can only be thankful as readers. I hope that it can be translated into Portuguese and published here. It would be very good.
Please help me.
Oh, we will try it. We have some contacts with different publishing houses here, university published houses or other academic-driven publishers, and we can try to. Don't you agree, George? To push forward translation.
No, we really try, and we think your book is central not only from English speakers, but also for the Brazilian politics, because many people are interested in Olavo de Carvalho because he's one of the keys to understand Bolsonaro's government. So your book is really a great contribution to this discussion, and we really try to find a place to translate and to put this interview in Portuguese for many more people to know your work.
Well,
thank you very much for your time and for the interview. All Andres has said.
Likewise, and thank you both for reading. I mean, that's very flattering. These are wonderful questions. So keep up the good work. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch. Eventually, thinking of other events such as seminars. Of course, with coronavirus, we'll have to think on online stuff like we did today. But let's maintain this partnership that I think can be very mutually beneficial. I mean, we both are scholars in political science, and especially in history of ideas. Both me and George, you come from the ethnomusicology, but we have a topic of interest and mutual interest. And we have here, for example, the colleague that couldn't be today, Camila Rocha, but some of the questions we made, she formulated originally. She is a political science, but also an ethnographer. And she does ethnography. Her doctoral thesis on the Brazilian New Right was based on ethnological methodology. In-depth interviews of participant observation and so on. So we have many people down here interested in your work through different viewpoints. So I think we have a lot to talk in the following months and years.
It would be an honor, really. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I'm not a Brazilianist or Latin Americanist. There's a lot I would love to learn from you all too. So I look forward to that.
Thank you very much, and have a nice evening and a nice week.
And please stay safe. You both. We read the news from Brazil, so keep yourselves.
Oh yes, it's very bad.
I know.
You too.
You too.
Okay.
Bye, Benjamin.
Bye.
Good night. Take care.
Good night. Take care.